I'm starting early and lunch is after me, so lock the doors. Yeah. I know people will be trickling in. Thank you for coming. I know you have some other options. I know people probably were out late. I really appreciate you coming to this talk. I really appreciate the organizers. Something else I appreciate is telling people what they can expect. So in this talk, I have a little scene setter. If you work with me at the Zoe Networks, you know that I also love a STAR foundation. So I'm going to walk through a situation, a task, an action, and a result. And then I'm going to talk about some findings from an exercise I did with the Water ISAC last fall and a tabletop exercise with them virtually. And I really, really appreciate the Water ISAC. And I want to give a shout out to Jen Walker, who's not here, but I am indebted to her for letting me be part of that exercise and to run my methodology through that organization. The scene setter. Okay. I also love to play Two Truths and a Lie, which is cut off on my screen but not on yours, so that's good. The first truth, double standards exist, okay? I ran this by Andy, and a good example of a double standard, which is defined as a rule or a principle that is unfairly applied to two different people or two different groups, is, some people find it unprofessional for women to cuss or swear in the workplace. But we were all pretty fucking excited when Andy Bachman got real on climate change on this stage last year. Another truth is if the best defense is a good offense, the most vulnerable are the least prepared. We see companies with tons of resources can buy multiple cybersecurity solutions, they can afford multiple assessments, and they can afford to check boxes on a compliance list. We see other organizations that can't afford that tend to be the least vulnerable, and ironically, this creates another double standard. And that brings me to the lie. And the lie is that heterogeneous systems equate to homogeneous risks. This is absurd and very obvious when we also talk about all of the different systems we think about when it comes to control and SCADA and intermediary systems that rely on IT but actually operate in OT. So this is the scene setter. What do we do about all of these double standards and how do we work to combat or eliminate them? Like I promised, the situation. We have a boatload of systemically critical hardware and software. We understand that this hardware and software underpins critical infrastructure, civil society, business, commerce, transportation, food, medical, prisons, etc. We get that, right? But this list of systemically critical, understanding that the interruption of these services and components could be dire, understanding that disruption could cause mass casualties or lead to mass evacuations, understanding that the perpetuation or the cascading impacts could disrupt the economy and have these ripple effects within a week, even a couple of hours, a month, depending on what we're talking about, that understanding doesn't help us prioritize. Neither does the designation that something is of national security significance, and neither does the understanding that the widespread compromise of these things is a bad scenario. So that's the situation I think we can all agree that we're in. It's not that systemically critical doesn't mean anything, it's that we can't prioritize what's critical if everything is critical, which I'm not the first person to state the obvious. So again, situation, I promised a task. If you're familiar with this diagram on the stage here, you've probably done fault-tolerant system design before. We are very good at fault-tolerant system design. We are very good at understanding cyber scenarios, risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. We are very bad at mapping the two and being able to pinpoint or illuminate that gap to be able to prioritize what an asset owner should do, focus on, or fund. So the need or the task is the need to prioritize. What is an OT incident? What does that mean? What is the definition? Does it have to be intentional, or could it actually be the manifestation of unintentional consequences? The most popular example of which is Colonial Pipeline. Do attacks have to be aimed at process control systems and SCADA to be considered an OT incident or not? And do they have to be conducted by a particular actor or threat actor or group, criminal group, or potentially an insider? A threat actor, what about accidents? Is a nefarious or otherwise benign insider who accidentally creates a cascading impact, is that an OT incident or not? Is that just an accident that we have emergency preparedness and response ready for? Who knows? So this is the task, the need to prioritize. Okay, situation, task, action. If we want to prioritize, preparedness equals tolerance. And you're never going to be prepared if you're not ready. And readiness leads to our favorite buzzword lately, which is resilience. Okay, so the action is being able to figure out and decouple, even before you get to like a Citrix evaluation of your actual systems, where is the highest concentration of control systems in use? You don't know, really. There's no inventory for that in our nation or even globally. Where are the most homogeneous deployed? Well, you could probably pinpoint a couple sectors where you could figure that out. You could do a little bit of due diligence on that. But broadly speaking, we don't understand, again, that gap analysis that is this fault-tolerant kind of assessment and how to truly do that from a cybersecurity perspective. Okay, so other questions that we're not really prepared to answer and understand the fault tolerance from a cyber perspective are things like which asset owner will be targeted next. There's no perfect target list out there, and nobody knows who's next on that list. Can you map component failures to your security concerns? Maybe. That's where Citrix tends to come in as well. To the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Maybe. If you have really, really good and intelligent people that are working on that, then you might be able to do the manual labor involved in mapping and doing that gap analysis that I just talked about. But broadly speaking, we still really struggle with these two, fault-tolerant systems design understanding and cyber scenarios that would actually create those fault-tolerant system design parameters that we are trained and ready to deploy. And then lastly, can you determine what component is most likely to be targeted in a tailored attack? Probably not, okay? And for me, that also begs the question, where does the attack surface actually begin and end anymore? I don't think any company could agree on that today in this room or at this conference. So situation, task, action, result. The result is focus. And in order to focus, there are two commonalities that every company, asset owner, government agency, think tank, et cetera, can agree on. And that is we need to eliminate this double standard between all of these different systems that don't, act and operate in the same way, and all of these kind of classic scenarios we have determined are simultaneously going to impact all of these organizations and deployments of systems in the same way. We have to unpack and eliminate that double standard. And at the same time, we can all actively work together to reduce the severity of impacts from cascading priorities that lead to that list of systemically critical being considered just that, systemically critical. So there's my situation, task, action, result. If you work with me at Nozomi, that is my favorite framework to basically position things against. So what? Who cares? Like I said, I was fortunate enough to run my methodology that I published last year with the Atlantic Council as an exercise with the Water ISAC last fall. And I won't go into the specifics of the methodology. If you want to read it, it's published on the Atlantic Council website. I also broke down the math behind it and the metrics and the weighting at the ICS SAN Summit last spring. So that's on YouTube. I think you can find it as well. So again, I won't go through the mapping, but the gist of the methodology is for asset owners to be able to have a stakeholder-wide conversation about prioritizing scenarios that they use internally for their tabletop exercises or externally for prioritization or for even mapping to their regulators, depending on what sector we're talking about. So this table that you can see up here helps to understand the cyber severity of an incident. I'm sure you've seen a table like it. I definitely took this from, it's cited in the paper, but I took this from somebody else and I modified it for the OT world. And so you could proactively look at this table and design scenarios you know would impact your organization and then be able to say at what severity level would they impact your organization. You could also use this table retroactively. And you could take scenarios we've already seen in the wild, like the recent water incident in Pennsylvania, as well as In Controller, that was the main talk of the town last S4. And you could also look at those incidents and answer these questions to determine the severity of those retroactively. So it has that dual use. So for the methodology that I put together with the Atlantic Council and with the Water ISAC, we didn't have time to let every asset owner that was involved in the ISAC conference make up their own scenarios. So we started with our own 6 scenarios, which I'm going to show you in a second, but these are not the only scenarios. So for this methodology, you can determine any 6 scenarios you want, and the math works out at the end. I'm not digging into the math today, but like I said, you can find it. Okay, so for the Water ISAC example, the exercise we ran last fall, these were the 6 scenarios that we determined we wanted to prioritize for water utilities. The first 3 are manipulation of view scenarios, and the last 3 are manipulation of control scenarios. So we took these scenarios, starting with ransomware that targets the organization with the ability to impact OT, ERP scheduling and logistics, kind of a third-party incident, as a manipulation of view concern, and then manipulation of view 3, inaccurate information sent to an operator that would then be the impetus for them to maybe take a bad decision, but it would be their decision, so that would be that potentially unknowing or unwilling insider threat scenario. And then for manipulation of control, we had modified configuration settings, third-party downstream, basically just-in-time type impacts, and then of course the big one that everyone considers the doomsday impact is the unauthorized changes to the instructions, commands, or operation of control systems or SCADA. And so again, any scenarios will work for your organization, but these were the ones that we decided to prioritize for the water end users there. And so they were first asked to rank and rate these scenarios based on this list from 10 to 50 for severity. You could spend all day doing this. You could do this internally. You could have somebody else come in and help you. But that was the goal for these scenarios. But why would we just stop at the cyber impacts of a scenario if I just got done telling you that systemically critical is something important but not very well understood? So the next step we did was we had these asset owners rank the ability of each of these scenarios to first cause public panic and to second overwhelm local response capacity. And every asset owner has the right to describe that and define that as they see fit. So here are those results. So for the first scoring, we just did that severity purely on the basis of the cyber incident from that table, that chart that I showed you with all the open questions about the incident, the threat, and the impact. 80% of the asset owners in this exercise said that manipulation of control number 3, the unauthorized changes to OT, was by and far the most severe cyber incident, just thinking about hardware and software components alone, and that question that you could work through in that table. 75% said manipulation of view, not control, number 3, that instruction sent to an operator that would then cause them to take the next step, the action in their network or their organization, was the most cyber severe scenario after that. And then you can see so on and so forth, and only 30% from a purely cybersecurity perspective thought that ransomware was actually the most severe cyber scenario. When we look at when we look at ranking for panic, so the ability for those same scenarios to also cause panic publicly or locally to that asset owner, their infrastructure, kind of where they sit in the world and who they serve, their population and customers, only 60% thought that manipulation of control 3 was the most likely to cause public panic, compared to the 80% that said it was the most severe cyber incident they could fathom from this list of 6. So we have 60% thought that that would be the most likely to cause public panic. Manipulation of view 3, again, the inaccurate information sent to systems operators, 30% thought that that would cause the most public panic. And then we move down the list again. And you see that, again, ransomware is down here at 20%. I'm a little concerned that nobody's that worried about third-party impacts, only because that does affect the math a little bit, but that's okay. But so you see kind of this shift away from what seems to be the most obvious scenario to focus on when you're doing your planning, your spending, your prioritization, your training, right, your stakeholder engagement, all of those things. It starts to shift, and 20% to me is not a small shift. So then we had them rank, and again, we have weighted scores in the math that tie these ranks back to a standardized score that we'll get to in a second, but when we ask these asset owners to then rank based on the ability to overwhelm local response capacity, manipulation of control 3 falls to 55%. So that's a good thing, right? People are a little bit more prepared than you might assume for that manipulation of control scenario that we immediately think and assume to be the worst cyber scenario on the list. Manipulation of view 3 drops to 15% when it talks about overwhelming local response capacity, because some of these things we've worked through and we've prepared for. But then if you look down to ransomware, that jumps up to 20% for our ability to overwhelm local resources. And then we combine them. And that's really the point of the methodology, is to combine that score, and we weight the ranking that we just went through for panic and severity. So when we move from just looking purely at the severity indicators of a cyber incident based on hardware and software impacts, first of all, we're not doing enough. And second of all, it's not taking into consideration all of the things that only asset owners can prioritize for themselves. And that's what panic and resource, once you define it and work through this methodology, can do for individual asset owners. So at the end, when we combine those scores and weight them, 60% still think that the manipulation of control 3 is the most worthy of prioritization for this exercise, and that's great, not a big deal. 15% think motivation of view 3, but if you look, and I know this isn't in a perfect rank because I kept them in the order of the actual scenario, But number 2 now is ransomware, when you combine the ability to overwhelm local response capacity and the ability for that scenario to cause public panic. But when you were ranking them individually, it didn't shuffle out to be a top concern or priority, and when you combine them, it does. And from a cyber severity perspective, a ransomware that doesn't impact OT is sometimes a success story and a win for us when we think about OT and ICS. So this is just a different way to unpack and consider these different scenarios. Again, who cares, right? Another assessment tool, another evaluation, another rendition of the government it doesn't know what they're doing and asset owners need more resources, right? We understand that. We have gotten really, really good at telling asset owners what they should do. We have never been very good at telling asset owners what they can realistically achieve. And I think that that's a really big difference, especially, I wasn't being funny, now that where the beginning of the attack surface starts and ends is more confusing each and every day, not less, despite all of our best efforts. So asset owners need to be able to better understand what scenarios to prepare them for, how prepared they are for them, and what to impact. And it's not that we don't understand the risks and threats. It's not that we can't understand weaknesses and enumeration. It's that we can't do them in real time. So back to that targeting list, nobody can tell you where the CWEs exist today and the exploit is prepared over here, and the most critical operation, because they all rely on 15 of the same PLCs and they have no backup systems, are over here in Texas, right? They can't do that. That's impossible. And so we need better ways to enable a future in which we can all come together on this prioritization issue. This methodology is, not even fancy math. I'm terrible at math, but it's not an assessment or compliance tool. It's free. It's not a piece of software. It's published. It's open source. It's not a threat feed. It's not an indicator. There are no IOCs, no CVEs, but it is a customized stakeholder engagement tool and a way to plan preparedness for cyber-physical impacts that do not stop at your networks. And I hate myself for using this meme. It is so tired. This meme is so tired, but it's true. So Dale was more excited about something else that this methodology produces, almost on accident, actually, when I was putting it together. And that's something that I promised in the abstract, and it's what I've called the standardized priority score. So, but wait, there is more. Leaders, governments, ISACs, and jurisdictions can actually use a standardized score to be able to prioritize individual asset owners using this methodology. You could do it for individual facilities as well, and then I also said you could use it internally. So the graph I'm going to show again, you could use within an asset owner to actually understand, Chad thinks this set of scenarios with this severity and this ranking is a 11, and Brian thinks that it's a 4, and Melissa is in the middle, and we can actually use that internally with your stakeholders to not just have a random qualitative conversation, but to actually break down your biases, your assumptions, your roles, and your responsibilities internally. So again, thanks to the Water ISAC for letting me do this. This next slide is that standardized priority score, and this is what that looks like. So this could be, like I said, internal to your organization. It could be regional, it could be geographic, you could do it within a sector, you could do it across a state, and you could do it cross-sector, which means you could actually rank a water utility versus an electric company versus a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility versus a prison, right? You could do critical, you could do it at a school, education, you could bring anything in your jurisdiction into this priority map. And this doesn't tell me that there's an asset owner in Illinois that is the most vulnerable or the most likely to be targeted. It does tell me that there's an asset owner in Illinois, which I will never share with any of you, right? I'll never share who the asset owners are on this list, but it does tell me that there's an asset owner in Illinois, and somebody who works there in this field thinks that they have a couple of scenarios that could potentially be very severe from a cyber-physical scenario, and those scenarios could lead to public panic and the ability to overwhelm their local response capacity. And I don't know about you guys, but I care about that. I want to help them, whether it's with a threat model or an assessment tool or choosing the right assessment tool or walking through compliance. I want to help that asset owner in Illinois. And I think that that's how we start to get at the prioritization problem. Definitely not the answer to everything under the sun or the rest of the priority issues that we have, but we're all kind of fighting for that same attention. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm going to remind everybody that we do have a common goal, and that is to eliminate double standards, whether it be between men and women in this field or between our prioritization and the way we think about heterogeneous systems and homogeneous outcomes. We all have the responsibility to reduce impacts and cascading factors that we haven't really considered from a purely systems design aspect for fault tolerance or cybersecurity scenario planning. And I want to remind everyone that cybersecurity is subjective. It's never going to be absolute. And that priority is not necessarily in the eye of the government. It's not necessarily in the eye of all the solution providers. It's not even in the eye of Dale Peterson, unfortunately. Priority is in the eye of the asset owner. And that's my talk for you today. So thanks for coming.